Welcome. I am so excited. We're going to talk today about birthing, fertility, and medical trauma. But before we jump right into that, I'm curious if you could tell people, who are you? Who's Sam?
So I'm Sam. I use she, her pronouns, and I am one of Cecile's students at Wellmine. I'm finishing my degree imminently. I'm very close, and I've been working through a lot of amazing clients and just joining as a new member of the team.
Wonderful. And so tell me a little bit. I mean, this is such a broad topic, but we've obviously grouped together birthing, fertility, and medical trauma. Like that's the heading of our conversation today. Can you tell me a little bit about why those three things are grouped together? Because they do seem a little bit different.
Yeah, it's amazing how the process of fertility, conception, becoming a parent, life after parent can be affected by a lot of the experiences that happen along the way. So, when there's types of trauma, and that can include medical trauma and any type of instance where it was just overwhelming, it affects the whole cycle of parenting. So, anything from preconception to even a year or more after birth.
Hmm. And what are some of like the effects when you say, it can impact the whole parenting process? What are some things that you might see in your office of kind of how it does that?
Yeah, the experiences of birth itself can be exceptionally overwhelming. It can be something that just shows up every day in moments of freeze or moments of overwhelm or moments of anger. It can be a lot of rage that shows up after the baby comes. It can be moments of disconnect with a partner, an inability to concentrate. There's a lot of different ways it can show up in the physical body, as well as your thoughts and feelings.
Yeah, so if I'm hearing you, you're really saying that because of this process, because of from preconception all the way to maybe birthing, we can end up in a trauma response. And then you're seeing that trauma response stick around if we don't do something to address it. Is that right?
Yeah, and it ends up infiltrating how we feel about ourselves as parents. That might even
Hmm.
show up as like, I'm a bad mom. I'm a
Yeah.
failure. I can't do this. This is too
Yeah.
hard.
Do you see that one show up in your office a lot? Kind of that feeling of like I'm a bad mom or I'm a failure of a parent because of these different issues?
Absolutely. I think it affects the way we conceptualize our ability to parent. And if we can't do something well or something feels overwhelming, or our bodies are overstimulated, our minds are overstimulated, we shut down. We don't end up meeting a need. And then we feel like a really terrible parent, bad mom, mom guilt. All of those types of terms can really show up for us throughout the whole spectrum of parenting, even in fertility. I feel like I'm not a very good woman. I'm not a woman, can't do this. Things are not working out for
Yeah.
me.
So you're just making me think of like the cycle that I could see happening where let's say it starts with I'm not a woman because I can't get pregnant. And then maybe you do get pregnant, but still hold that trauma. And then suddenly it's I'm a bad mom. And then maybe you're disconnected and you're not able to act the ways that you would want to because of your trauma. And now suddenly it reinforces that belief and then it just deepens it and round we go.
Yeah. And you stay stuck in that spiral and unable to get out of it. And then things just mount on top. And the more things that happen, the more overwhelm happens. And the more you end up living that out every day.
Yeah. So I wonder if I can kind of double back a little. You've spoken about how all the way from preconception to postpartum, there can be kind of this trauma. I'm wondering if we could go through some of those stages. And I think something I see in my practice a lot is that people experience something traumatic, but they don't know it's traumatic. So I'm wondering if we could go through that time and just talk about some of the things that can be traumatic during that process so that maybe folks who don't have that understanding can get some understanding today of the fact that this can be traumatic. Would that feel all right?
Yeah, that feels great. One of the biggest things is that if you experience something that is way too overwhelming for you, you can't make sense of it and it doesn't feel right, you are allowed to label that as something traumatic. So that is up to
Absolutely.
the person who experienced it. It's not necessarily if it meets a textbook criteria, that could be considered something else, but we can also feel that in ourselves and kind of take that label as something that might feel powering in a way for you to understand and conceptualize your experience. So that's the first thing. So anything that happens in this spectrum of time and beyond, but specifically in this spectrum, you get to say if that was too much for you, if that was overwhelming, if that felt traumatic.
Hmm. So
Yeah.
tell me, Sam, in that kind of preconception period, what would be maybe some experiences that people have come into counseling for that you know of that we might, that someone might choose to call traumatic from that kind of preconception period?
Yeah, there's a lot of disconnect in the medical community. So if someone is experiencing something like infertility and they walk into a clinic that's very cold, they're given a 1 word or 2 word answer and kind of sent back out the door with not a lot of understanding, not a lot of empathy, and not a lot of digging in behind as to why this might be the case that you're experiencing infertility. That can be extremely distressful process. So having a rupture with the medical community, not understanding, not being given information can feel very isolating, very lonely. And like you've done something wrong if what they've prescribed or the treatment they're suggesting doesn't work. And you end up feeling like it's your fault or something's happened that you caused this.
Mm.
And not having someone to go to in the medical community to support you through that and to actually explain that there may be other things going on and how that impacts the body ends up feeling like it's my fault. I must have done something incorrect. I must have done something to deserve this. This is something I had control over. And then being put in a position where you're out of control and you have no
Yeah.
control or autonomy over what's happening to you.
And you're just making me think of, the amount of courage and vulnerability that it must take to go to that appointment in the first place. If you've been trying to conceive and maybe it's just not happening naturally, you go to the doctor and then to meet this cold, clinical, dismissive system. Wow, that must be even more distressing, even more traumatizing because you were probably already in that space of vulnerability.
Yeah, and how scary it is to have to even openly talk about a lot of things that don't get discussed and have to
Yeah.
be in a place of discussing maybe with your partner, maybe with your doctor, or being dismissed, being told this happens to everybody. Oh, it's fine. Here you go. This happens to millions of people. It's not always an encouraging thing to hear that when there's no
Yeah.
follow or no connection. It takes a
Yeah.
lot of courage.
Okay. So I'm hearing so much during this preconception phase around the beliefs, the traumatic beliefs that we can get of kind of it's my fault or I'm a failure if I can't get pregnant. Tell me a little bit kind of moving through. So what might be the next traumas that you can see happening, maybe let's say early pregnancy stages?
I think a really big one is miscarriage and loss.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of effects that happen, of course, to our minds and hearts when that's happening. There's a lot of things in the medical community with loss that are not spoken about, and especially where along in the pregnancy things might have happened, and especially if
Mm-hmm.
there's a point in time where the miscarriage has occurred and it was a later term and it was a little bit further along in the pregnancy and different processes that have to happen around that time where you may be carrying a fetus that's no longer viable and how the
Mm-hmm.
effects, the impacts that that can have, knowing that that's happening for you, how to get support, how to talk about that. You got so excited that things were progressing in such a good way, and now suddenly the baby's no longer viable or it's actually died.
Yeah. You're just making me think of like the overlap between the trauma and the grief and how those two would feel one and the same, I imagine, of not being able to distinguish them because there's so much trauma on your body, on your health, and then the grief of the lost life that we've had and the lost baby.
Yeah, grief around the things that could have happened, grief around the things that are happening now, the dreams that you had, and what this might mean for your overall journey into becoming a
Mhm.
parent. The grief is
Yeah,
very heavy, very heavy.
yeah. Wow. Okay. So then as we kind of approach pregnancy itself, tell me about that in terms of trauma. I mean, we hear a lot about traumatic births. Can you shine some light on what that means, what that can look like?
Yeah, I get a lot of clients who have need to take a little bit of time to process the actual experience from going into labor to coming home with baby or not coming home with baby, and what that means and what that happens when you kind of walk into this medical system, particularly hospitals in this instance, but you walk into that space with no control and no autonomy over what's happening. There are medical choices being made for you. You may or may not have been able to provide consent. How does that feel knowing that your body is not yours in those moments? And there's a little life, there's a little baby that we're trying to keep protected, trying to keep safe, trying to trust that everyone is doing their best in those moments, and yet not feeling empowered enough to have that trust and
Hmm.
not knowing, if suddenly something happens, the baby's taken away, how that must feel. and we're already in a moment of distress and already in a moment of feeling like those traumatic experiences have already started.
As you know, a big part of my practice is working with folks who have childhood trauma. And I'm just thinking about that re-traumatization that could occur when, let's say, someone experienced a childhood trauma around sexual assault, not having control of their body, not having bodily autonomy. Now we're in this system where we are trusting the doctors to keep our baby, keep us and the baby safe. And yet we don't have control, we don't have autonomy. And we might just be bringing back up all of that old wounds in this moment and really maybe reinforcing, or we might be experiencing it for the first time, but learning this new message of my body isn't mine, I don't have control.
Yeah. And just being in a space where you might not have anyone to turn to express how that's feeling. And
So that aloneness in it.
aloneness, totally. The aloneness, there might be, 10, 12 people in the room and you're feeling alone. You're feeling scared. You're feeling isolated. You're not sure what's happening. You're not sure if you can ask permission, if you can ask questions. And just the same feelings that are coming up before might be happening again on top of an additional experience. So it's just mounting, and
Yeah.
how that is
Yeah.
impacting your physical self.
As we're talking about this word aloneness, I'm feeling like that must be a part of the trauma throughout the entire process, from the preconception to anything that might be happening during pregnancy to the birthing of, maybe others have experienced this, but we're probably quite alone in that moment of that experience. Is that true? Am I correct in making that assumption, Sam?
I would have to agree. I think there's a misconception that birth is a universal experience. It happens
Sure.
to all mammals, reptiles, happens to everything, all the creatures. This is how we procreate. There's a misconception around, because it happens to everyone, what's happening to me must be normal, or I must be able to deal with it on my own. Because if
Ah,
it is normal, if this is happening, everyone goes through this, then my experience must not, I must not be able to talk about it because it's supposed to be normal. It's supposed to go this way. I'm supposed to be able to deal with this.
okay. So I'm hearing such a like societal belief of you're supposed to, this is normal, figure it out. The reality being that this is traumatic and we need that support, we need that help.
Yes. And what's universal or considered normal doesn't mean that that's not overwhelming and that's not something that's going to really deeply impact you, and that it is happening to others. It is a common experience that's occurring across at least Western medical systems.
Sam, I love what you just said there. Just because it's normal doesn't mean it's not traumatic. That just because many people experience this doesn't mean you're not having a traumatic response or a traumatic experience, and that you deserve that help for it.
You
So
really deserve to have time to process it and go through it, make sense of what happened, and gain back a feeling of that agency and control.
yes. So tell me, post birth, tell me about trauma that can happen kind of in that period of time.
Sure. Post birth, we are looking at things like experiences in the NICU. So, children that have to spend time away from their families
Mhm.
in those first few moments of life, first few weeks, maybe even first few months, and how stressful that is to be in a high risk emergency environment, knowing that there's machines and medical equipment doing the best it can to keep that baby alive, the impact that might have on how you feel about your role as a mother from those first few
Mm,
moments, or your role as a parent from those first few moments, and how, again, out of control and scary those things are, even after baby's arrived.
yeah. So baby's arrived, and yet we still don't have control necessarily, or we might still feel like a failure or not good enough, alone. So many things can continue to happen even once baby is here.
Yeah, and this is my fault. I did something to cause
Mm,
this. Now I have to deal with these consequences. And I did something so that this happened because of me or because of something I did.
yeah. Yeah, I did wrong. That's why this is happening, which is such a hallmark of trauma, the belief that I caused this somehow or I'm bad. That's why it happened.
Yeah, didn't try
Yeah.
hard enough. Couldn't
Yeah.
couldn't make it work. Something's wrong with me, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've kind of gone through some different experiences of trauma. And of course, naming that many people, there might be more than this. This is just a few different ones.
Mhm.
What can people do? Like, let's say someone acknowledges, right, this was traumatic at some period throughout this. What can they do, Sam? What's next to support them or help them?
The biggest thing is just realizing that what is normal for someone else might be really deeply impactful for you, and that you need to seek support. That's
Mm,
an exceptional hurdle to overcome, especially if there are people around you in your life making you feel like you just need to get over it and move on. You're lucky you have a baby. You're
Ah,
lucky the baby is home with you now. That everyone goes through this, just get over it. So if you're experiencing those types of messages in whatever environment you're in, being able to say, actually, this wasn't okay and I'm not okay, that is an exceptional first step to be able to
yeah.
ask for help.
So I love that. And I would almost break that down as two steps that you're sharing there of like acknowledging that I'm not okay and I need some help and then seeking that support, getting that support.
Yeah, getting
What
that.
can that support look like? Do you have any resources or ideas of what that could be for people?
Yeah, one of my favorite things to recommend, and this is just a recommendation without having, spoken individually with people, but is to find similar experiences amongst your own peers and friends. And that
Hmm.
might mean talking about it openly, which is really quite terrifying.
Yeah.
But there is a beautiful connection to be made with other parents who have had like similar experiences. So finding connection amongst peers, that could be online, that could be through social media, that could be in mom groups or parent groups, but having the courage to share what happened can create some really beautiful connections to help normalize the experience and to make it feel as though you're not alone in this. And there might be other parents who have gone through something similar to build those connections. That's a
Yeah.
really important place to grow that community connection and that feeling of not being alone. That's a great step to take in the immediate interim. And there's also other things where resources can be really helpful. So reaching out for counseling support, that's a really big, important step. It can be something short term, it can be something longer term, depending on what's been happening before and during.
Mm. Could you tell me
Mhm.
a little bit more about that one, Sam? Of let's say someone picks up the phone and they say, Sam, I want to get some counseling. I have trauma related to some point in this process.
Mhm.
What could counseling look like? And I know I'm asking a tough question because, of course, it's going to depend on the individual in front of you and all of those pieces. But could you kind of, if someone's thinking about it and maybe nervous about the process, can you give us some light as to what that could look like?
Yeah. In my process, it's a very slow process. We're not going to be rushing into anything. My expectation is not you're just laying it all out or sharing it on the first session, and that we're going to build a relationship together and find some trust and commonality. And then we're going to bring the experiences through as slowly or as quickly as you'd like to. So that
Mm,
could mean talking about it very openly from the moments of what first happened when it started to feel overwhelming. Or that might mean looking back a little bit, doing a bit of a history dive and developing a rapport with each other before we get to a place where we are able to really unpack what happened and talk about it. So it can be really slow, really supported place. It can be a process that feels exactly right and you have control and you're leading the pace of the session.
I love what you're saying because to me it sounds the real opposite of that like cold clinical medical system that you were talking about of like, come in, we do this, get out, it's over. This, the person would maybe like pace it a little bit more for what their needs are of, I want to talk about it, I'm ready, or like, no, we're not going to talk about that for a while. I don't want to go there. But they get to set that pace rather than having some outside person telling them what's supposed to happen.
Right. And there's no one process that fits everybody. And so it's quite challenging to be like, oh, in 8 sessions, you'll be ready and back to your normal self. So that it's harder for us to predict, but trusting in the process, that developing it at a pace that works well for you and working on the therapeutic aspects of it every session, even if you're not ready to dive into the most traumatic things, that therapeutic process is going to support you. It's going to work in the magical ways that it works to get you into a place where you're ready to share and go through and process with support all the things that have happened leading up to those moments.
Yeah, beautiful. That last piece there of like with support that we've talked about a lot of this as like alone through this. And that could be part of what's traumatizing. And what can be different about counseling is like that support that you're not in this alone anymore. Someone's there with you, regardless of where you're at mentally, emotionally, physically, they're meeting you right there.
Yeah. Yeah. Meeting
Beautiful.
you and staying with you along the process.
Beautiful. Thank you so much today, Sam, for your expertise, your wisdom, and just your beautiful, calm demeanor. I'm just like, I feel so safe and comfortable with you. I can only imagine other people would feel that way too. So thank you for bringing that and bringing all your knowledge today.